welcome to this week's episode of CSM Live. Thank you for being here. We're in James part 2, and we're just going to jump right in. I want to ask you a question real quick. What is one of the most death-defying stunts that you have ever been a part of? Maybe you've been skydiving, maybe you've done something that you thought was a little extreme, or even just a death-defying stunt that you've witnessed, something on TV or in a show or things like that. A few weeks ago, my wife and I in Easton, we were watching America's Got Talent. Now, usually these danger acts, they don't intrigue me. I feel like there's always some sort of safeguard to where any sort of real risk is mitigated. Like real risk, something real dangerous, real injury isn't possible. There's always something there to prevent that from happening. But a few weeks ago, we saw one, and I was kind of taken aback at how risky this guy was willing to go and perform this event in order to make it on this show. And I can talk you through it, but rather than talking you through it, check this out.
Lady. Now I have 4 more crossbows that are identical, but these are on stands. They are all armed and loaded and dangerous right now. And underneath the crossbows are these containers of water. At the bottom of the containers, you can see that there are these taps, and directly underneath the taps are these sports bottles. The bottles are connected to the triggers of the crossbow. And what that means is this: when we turn on the taps, the water will flow into the bottles. And when it hits a critical weight, the crossbows will fire. Different sized bottles means that the crossbows will fire at different times, directly into this target, which is where I'm going to be standing, blindfolded.
No.
I have to listen to the sound of the water flowing exactly like you did, Howie, and get out of the way. This is blindfold chicken with crossbows.
It's nuts. Oh no.
Oh, I don't want to see this.
April. In 3, 2, 1, go.
I mean, he is crazy.
That's nuts.
No. Oh no. Whoa! What? Oh!
That is so close.
Whoa!
They come out fast.
And if you thought that was scary, I've got 3 more that are even scarier.
Right? No doubt this dude had some serious time and effort and training invested into being able to pull this stunt off. He had obviously spent some time listening to the water bottles, timed it out perfect. He knew which crossbow was going to fire when, but it still took some incredible faith in his ability to pull it off. Like, I was thinking when I saw that, what if his hand slipped and he wasn't able to pull that book up right at the end to catch that last one? Like, it still took some faith in his ability. And what we're going to dig into today in the second part of James is this idea of real faith and how we put it to the test in these times of going through struggles and in these tough times that we're going to face. Now, what we saw in that video was sort of a reliance on self, some faith that he had in his ability. Now, that's not what James is talking about here, though he does address it. And as we talked about last week in James, when we go through trials and tough times in our lives, they are a way to grow in our faith, and we're going to continue that from there. So in James chapter 1, verse 9, James writes this. He says, "Let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation, and let the rich in his humiliation, because like a flower of the grass, he will pass away." So truth is, sometimes when going through a hard time, it's easy to get prideful. Now you may think that's impossible. How can I get cocky and arrogant when I'm going through a tough time? Isn't that when people are usually the hardest on themselves? But we have to look at what pride actually is. Pride ultimately is looking to yourself rather than looking to Jesus. See, during trials, Christians are tempted to fix it. I think most of us are tempted to be like, I just got to put my head down. I got to power through. I need to get through this. We're tempted to handle it on our own strength. But James here, he's bringing up everyone's need, whether it be rich or poor, to rely on Jesus and not on themselves. And what we see here, what James is trying to teach us, is that genuine faith leads to genuine humility. And when I'm talking about humility, humility isn't just thinking lowly of yourself. But what it is thinking less of yourself and more highly on Jesus. See, when we have humility, when we have this genuine faith that produces this genuine humility in our lives, we recognize our need, and we recognize that need that everyone has for the saving grace of Jesus Christ in their lives. And having a true understanding of that need, of knowing our position, our situation that we are in, having a true understanding of that only leads us to a position and to a heart of humility and thankfulness for what Jesus has done. Like, the only thing that I have to boast about is the grace of Christ and the love that he has shown me. But this becomes difficult for us because pride wants to rear its ugly head in every situation that it can. Pride, in the midst of a struggle, is a temptation that we must fight. Because pride says, I can get through this. Pride says, I know what is best for me. Pride says, I can satisfy myself. I can make myself happy. I can see me through this. I can fix this. I can do what I need to do to get me through this tough time. I can take care of this. I don't need to have humility to look at Jesus. And that's what pride is saying. And that is what we have to fight. That's a temptation we are going to face. Because when we give in to this temptation, we often want to turn it back and blame it on God and act as if he put us in a position that sinning and giving into this temptation was our only option. Look at verses 13 and 16. Verses 13 through 16 say this. Say, let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. So notice here how James does not say, do not be tempted. He doesn't say, do not be tempted, but he says, do not be deceived. See, when we're going through trials, often we are at our weakest. Satan loves to prey on people who are vulnerable. Because people who are weak and people who are vulnerable, he thinks those are easy targets. And often it's true. When we're our most vulnerable, when we're our weakest, we can be an easy target. But when we go through trials, we often doubt. We struggle with prayer. We struggle with time in the Word. We struggle with wanting to come to church and be around other Christians. But while going through these struggles, while going through these hardships, these are times that we need prayer the most. We need the wisdom of God and what we can get from his word. We need the encouragement of other Christians in our lives. These are times that we need to surround ourselves with other people so that we cannot give in to these temptations. Because God does not tempt us to sin. When we are doubting, we often think that that's what is happening. We often think that God is the one tempting us to sin. And we could think that, God, if you weren't allowing this in my life, then I wouldn't have to sin like this. But James here, he gives us a very solid truth. He says that God will never tempt us to sin because God himself cannot be tempted to sin. We must remember there is a huge difference between temptation and sin. Temptation is the enticement to sin, but then the act of sin is actually giving into it. So when we are tempted to sin, that's like being at a restaurant. It's like going out and you see some, like Texas Roadhouse, for example. They're sweet, soft, warm rolls that they have, and they have that warm cinnamon butter. When they bring those out like that, those are appetizing. You can smell them, you can see them. Like they just look warm and nice, and like you want to eat those. They're appetizing. But then when you actually give in and eat it, now you're satisfying that appetite. Temptation is that appetite, and then actually acting on that sin is eating. James is saying here, do not give in. He puts it simply. He says, do not be deceived by temptation to where you give in and act on that sin. But he calls us to remember that the same faith that saved us is going to sustain us through these trials and through these temptations in our lives. Look at verses 17 and 18. In verses 17 and 18, he writes this. It says, every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Of his own will, he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. So James reminds us here in these verses of the faithfulness of God while we're going through trials. That the same God who designed the expanses of the sky is the one who created you and cares for you in the midst of what you're going through. Like that is so just like it's incredible to think about that the same God who created the universe cares about you in the tough times that you're going through. James reminds us that it is God's word that brought us to salvation, so it is God's word that will sustain us through these trials. And then in verses 19 through 21, James calls us to listen to God. In these verses, he says, be slow to speak and quick to listen and slow to anger. And what James is doing here is he's not instructing us to listen to others, but he's being specific in instructing us to listen more to the voice of God. He's reminding us to listen to God more than we listen to ourselves and we listen to that whisper of temptation as we're going through those trials. We can be so quick to complain and we can be so quick to get angry at God when we're going through tough times. And James is telling us we need to put those thoughts away. We need to push those voices that are telling us to be mad at God aside. And we just need to dig into him. We need to be quick to listen to God, as he says here, by receiving the implanted word in our lives. Remembering God's faithfulness and listening to him is living like you are saved through the trials. Philippians 2:8 reminds us how Jesus did this. Philippians 2:8, it tells us that, and being found in human form, talking about Jesus, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. That even as Jesus was going through one of the toughest trials in human history, he remained obedient all the way to death on the cross. And then lastly, in these last few verses of James chapter 1, verses 22 through 27, these verses tell us to be doers and not hearers only. And what that means for us is in these trials in our lives, they often give us an excuse to live in sin rather than for Jesus. In these times, we need to be careful. You need to watch yourself. You need to watch yourself when you're going through these trials. Call out your pride to live in humility. You need to watch where Satan might tempt you so that you can run to Jesus in those times, so that you can run to Jesus in prayer, run to his word, run to his wisdom. And remember that our salvation is proven when we live for Jesus in the more difficult times. Because if Jesus is truly worth living for, then he is worth living for in those trials, in those struggles, in those tough times, and he is worth living for in those times of peace.